Hey, so this is the Drunkalogs, a podcast about addiction and recovery in which each guest shares their version of how it was, what happened, and how it is now, and then endures a half-hour Q&A at the hands of your host, Nick Morton. My next guest just published his first book, a memoir called Lost in Ghost Town, about his journey from an affluent childhood in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., to a dark stint of homelessness in Venice, California, where he worked as a driver for the Shoreline Crips, and there found a sense of place and self-worth that eventually fueled his recovery. He now has a PhD in psychology and works as a therapist here in Los Angeles, helping patients grapple with anxiety, depression, trauma, and addiction. Won't you please welcome Carter Stout. So, where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Georgetown, Washington, D.C.
Oh, right. Were you born there?
I was born in New York City.
Right.
Born in New York Hospital, but soon after, when I was about 1 year old, my family moved down to Washington. My father was a lawyer in New York, and he saw an opportunity to start a magazine down in D.C., which he did in 1969 called National Journal, which was a political magazine. And that prompted us moving to Georgetown, and we lived in a little townhouse on O Street.
Huh.
And my early days, my early childhood, I have a lot of really good memories. I had an older brother named Craig, who he and I were very close. We were about a year apart.
Right.
And it was sort of an idyllic first part of my childhood. Felt very safe, felt very, just felt very much, I guess, in tune with myself as a young boy. And as I grew a bit older, I became aware that my folks really weren't around very much.
Right.
My mom was a socialite. She was always off doing things with her friends, and my dad was a workaholic.
Right.
And he was at the office, or he was traveling, I would say, more than 50% of the time. So he was kind of an absent father in my life. And that ultimately led to some feelings that maybe he didn't really care about me too much.
Sure.
And my mom began to develop, I think in his absence, a thirst for alcohol.
Right.
And as I grew into my adolescence, she really, her love of alcohol increased, and she became a full-blown alcoholic.
Right.
And was one from that point until the day she died,
right.
Which was she died about 11 years ago of alcoholism.
Right. Wow.
So if I can pinpoint the origins of my addictive tendencies, I would say they really originated from these feelings that I had of being neglected.
Sure.
You know, we had a lot of advantages, certainly.
Right.
My parents were successful, and I grew up in an affluent way. And, you know, from the outside, of course, things looked really good. But on the inside, I felt a little left out.
Sure.
And I was really searching for that compassion and for that love that wasn't there.
And when did you start drinking? I assume it began with drinking, yeah?
Began pretty early, yeah. My older brother, God bless him, was quite a defiant, rebellious youth, and he had friends. And the first time I drank, I was about 7, and we had filled up a backpack with beer from the fridge. My dad was
and he's this older, corrupting influence at the age of 8.
That's right. And we actually stole my mom's cigarettes too. So we had cigarettes and we had a backpack with, I think, 4 beers in it.
Right.
And we decided that we were going to run away from home.
Right.
And we'd been told that we couldn't cross the street by our nanny and by my mother, but we broke the rules and that day. And we went down under a bridge in Georgetown and popped these beers, drank these beers, smoked some cigarettes, and I, of course, got blasted out of my mind.
Right.
And remember really liking the feeling, but also being terrified by it.
Yeah.
And I got really scared, and it began to rain, and it was the late afternoon. It began to get dark, and we decided that we weren't really going to run away.
Right.
And so we hightailed it back home. That was the first experience that I had with alcohol. And just a few years later, when I was 9, growing up in Georgetown in the 70s was a really unique experience. It was Georgetown, which is now sort of one of the epicenters of commerce in Washington, D.C., was much different back then. It was a lot of privately owned little shops. There was the baker, next to the seamstress, next to the jewelry maker, next to the local ice cream store. And it was really kind of a magical place. And on pretty much every corner at that time, there was a head shop.
Right.
And so Craig and I, my older brother, used to walk down the street, and we had very little parental supervision. So we were always wandering off into Georgetown and say we were going to the arcade, but really just sort of wandering around looking for trouble. And we used to marvel at all of these big glass bongs in the window and covet them and thought about, dreamed about the day that we would be able to have one or use one. And I don't think we even really knew what they were for.
Right.
But they were just this really interesting thing. And so there was an older kid who lived in the neighborhood who was about 13 at the time. And Craig had made friends with him. So Craig was 9 and this kid was 13. And this guy was really the bad kid in the neighborhood. Bad influence. And he had a tree house in his backyard. And his father was a politician who had to travel a lot. So he was left at home alone.
Right.
And he invited us over to his house one Saturday afternoon. And he lived right by M Street and Wisconsin, which was a big intersection in Georgetown. And so we walked with him, and he brought us to one of these head shops.
Right.
And we walked up into the head shop because he knew the owner. And all of a sudden we were inside this head shop, and there were bongs all around, and the guy was smoking clove cigarettes, and he was this older guy. And he at first said, what are you kids doing in my store? But then he said, oh, okay. And he started laughing, and our friend bought weed off of him in the store. So he's 13, he buys weed, and then we buy a bong, and we went back to his tree house and smoked bong hits all afternoon. So I was 9, my brother was 10, and he was 13.
What does a bong hit feel like when you're 9? I mean, do you remember?
I remember laughing more than I'd ever laughed.
Wow.
I remember having a really, really fun time, and there was music. He had a radio out there, and we were dancing around to music. And I think I got scared at one point as well because it was overwhelming. The feeling was just felt so out of control.
Yeah.
And that was my first real taste of being seriously altered.
Right.
And then from that point forward, my brother always had a little pot. He always had a little pot around, and he would roll joints and We would smoke joints out on the window ledge when I was 10 or 11. I remember for my 11th birthday, he gave me 2 joints. And so it was pretty early. And of course, our parents were oblivious to what was going on. They had
Sure.
absolutely no idea. But you know, I definitely remember those times fondly. And it wasn't until about maybe 11 or 12 that things started to darken in my life. And I talk about this in a memoir that I've just written. But
I'm sorry to laugh, but it's like things get dark at this point.
Yeah, I know. Well, things actually did get dark. It's funny, but my parents were were starting the process of getting a divorce.
Right. Sure.
And there was a lot of unhappiness in my home.
Right.
There was a lot of yelling. There was a lot of crying. My mother was medicating with alcohol, and she was really coming apart at the seams. And I was really confused by all of it.
Right.
So at age 12, I want to say 11 or 12, I developed an eating disorder.
Oh, wow.
And that was something that was strange for an adolescent boy.
Sure.
And not very common. And I think it was the way and eating disorders, of course, are similar to other addictions.
Right.
They're a food addiction. It's an obsessive compulsive experience, just like medicating with alcohol.
Right.
or drugs. And it was a way that I soothed myself during that time.
And how did it manifest itself as?
I don't really remember.
Right.
It just began. It
Right.
started with me. I stopped nourishing myself completely.
Right.
It started that way. And then it became, it turned into eating food and then, binging and purging.
Right. Right.
And it was discovered by my mother a few years later, but of course she had absolutely no idea what to do.
Right.
And I was brought to a therapist, and I didn't really want to admit it or deal with it. And so I just lied about it and said that I had only done it a few times.
Right.
But it was something that continued on for years after that.
Wow.
So that addictive energy, and that's what I call it,
Right.
was in me from a very young age.
Sure.
And I think what that grew into was a feeling that I wanted to be detached from whatever the experience of the reality of my life was. And so back then it was my parents are getting divorced. My brother got my father got custody of my brother. They moved out. All of a sudden my best friend was gone. It was very, very sad. Very
Sure.
And then I went off to boarding school,
Uh-huh.
age 14. And
So you go to boarding school for 9th grade?
For 9th grade.
Right.
Yeah, boarding school in 9th grade. And still very broken at that time. Still very despondent, confused. Wasn't really sure who I was as a person.
And do you still have the eating disorder when you get to boarding school? Right. Wow.
I do. Throughout the whole time at boarding school I had it.
Wow.
It was very secretive, but I did.
Wow.
But at boarding school I met some young people from New York City, and we became fast friends. Right. And they were my form mates, and was the first time really that I had a group of friends that I really felt safe with and I really trusted. And I think growing up in New York City was different from growing up in DC. They all wore these long black trench coats, and they had jean jackets, and they had their hair cut a certain way. And they were the cool kids, definitely. And so I quickly changed my haircut and my wardrobe to be like them. And
Right.
anyway, they very much were the type of kids that scoffed at authority. They were very bright, very intelligent, really great people, and many of them, or most of them, are still my friends today, 35 years later.
And were they all drinking and using at that point by the time
they
got
were
to boarding school?
They were experimenting with drugs. Yeah.
Right.
They had parents that were sort of liberal and maybe hippie-ish in the city. And so I used to go to New York on breaks, on spring break and fall break, and stay with them in the city. And I thought that there was no supervision in my house, but there was really no supervision.
Right, New York, next level.
Their parents were just nowhere. And we would go out, and I never went out.
Right.
And, at age 14 and 15, we were going out to these clubs in New York City.
Totally.
And I just couldn't believe it. It was just like I was.
Were you guys partying at school as well?
We were whenever we could.
Right.
There was a lot of pot around,
right.
so we would smoke pot at night, and we would try and get alcohol whenever we could.
Right.
And then there were the psychedelics that we were always trying to get our hands on.
Right.
So we would go off on weekends, and we would take mushrooms, and we would go and whenever we could, we would try and go to see the Grateful Dead at a show.
And I mean, did you feel like you were like miles ahead of everyone because you'd been partying since you were 7, or did you feel like you were kind of on par with?
I felt like I was on par with them.
On par, like that was everyone was kind of the same. Like they.
I don't know if they started as early, but I think the amount that
was still the same.
Was more
than
and the accessibility that they had. Because at that time, Central Park in New York City, you could go pretty much buy whatever you wanted. There were always people. And so they immediately took me to the park the first time I went there. And I thought to myself, I can't believe it. I mean, they also brought me to a deli one time in New York on 96th and 1st called Belsom's. And you walked right into the back of the deli, and there was a window, and you just bought weed.
Right.
I thought to myself, this is unbelievable.
Right.
It's like a store that sells weed, This was back in the early 80s.
Sure. And
anyway,
and did you manage to make it through boarding school without getting in trouble, or were you always in trouble?
I got in a lot of trouble at boarding
school.
I did. I got in a lot of trouble. It was, my mother. It's a funny story. I had a roommate my sophomore year, one of these guys from New York, and I'm still great friends with him today. He's a writer, and every fall there's a parents' weekend, and where all the parents come up, and there are activities that are centered around doing things with your parents, and everyone meets each other, and the parents all stay in hotels and take you out to dinner and stuff. Well, I had asked my mom if she would buy me a couple cases of beer.
Right.
Which she proceeded to do. And she showed up at boarding school with a couple cases of beer and brought them into our room. And we had a refrigerator, a small little refrigerator in the closet, which we stuffed 2 cases of beer in.
Is she even trying to hide it, or is she aware?
She had it in brown bags.
Right.
But I mean, we were 14, 15 years old.
Right.
And it was obviously very much against the rules.
Right.
So she was a co-conspirator.
Right.
But so we ended up getting really drunk that night, and my roommate's parents, we went off to class on Saturday. We had classes on Saturday morning, and they showed up at our room about half an hour early, and they heard this buzzing coming from the closet. So they went into the closet and found our fridge, and there was still about a case of beer in it. And then they found a little stash of pot that we had in the room. And so when we showed up after lunch, after classes, we got a tongue lashing from them.
Right.
A very funny quote that is etched in my memory forever is my roommate's father. There was this little brass box that my roommate had taken from his apartment in New York City. It was his parents, and it's what we used to put our weed in. And when we arrived after lunch, his father was holding the brass box in his hand, and he opened it up and he said, "What does this smell like?" And my roommate said, "Brass." And his father looked at us and he said, "Panama brass." Which I thought, wow, that is just one of the greatest things I've ever heard.
Amazing.
But so, yeah, we got into a lot of trouble. I ended up driving a car up to school and parking it in a lot outside of campus, which was against the rules. And we got caught with the car. We got caught drinking. And after my junior year, I got expelled.
Oh, really? I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Wow.
Yeah, I got expelled.
And where'd you go?
I went back to DC, and there
Right.
was a boys' school in Washington that I had gone to before, boarding school called St. Albans School.
Uh-huh.
And so I finished up there my senior year, and really tried to buckle down at that point because I was terrified that I wasn't going to get into college anywhere.
Right.
And
did you behave at St. Albans?
I did.
Right. Wow.
I
Right.
really did. I mean, for the most part.
Right.
There were certainly the weekends that my brother would show up and we would get a bunch of cocaine, or we would take acid. I mean, there were those weekends certainly, but for the most part, especially in the fall, all I did was work because
Right.
I really, from such an early age, this idea of college was thrust at you.
Right. And the idea that you've botched this opportunity.
Yeah, there was a lot of fear.
Like your life is over.
Right. And at boarding school, there was so much focus on college applications and where you're going to go to college and all of this stuff.
What'd they ultimately throw you out for?
For lying.
Oh, right.
Because I told we concocted a story. 4 of us got caught, and we concocted this story. And it was the last week of spring term. So we all went home for the summer.
Right.
Thought that we had gotten away with it. And over the summer, they called us in one by one. And we had created this story that we were all supposed to stick to. Well, the first 3 of them, when they were confronted, they caved.
Right.
And they told the truth. And so I went in there blind.
Right.
Pre-cell phone. So people
weren't. No one could tell you.
Summer too much. No one told me. And so I went in there and I stuck to the story.
Oh, wow.
And they said, if you had told the truth,
right,
we would let you back in, but didn't happen.
Damn. And then I assume you go to college, yeah?
I went out to college, and college for me was just really an extension of boarding school.
Right. Where'd you go?
I learned very much. I went to Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut.
Right.
Number of people I knew from different places were there. Certainly a contingent from St. Paul's School, where I went to boarding school, and I didn't study very hard, didn't learn very much, and it was the focal point was drinking. It was a lot of. I was in a fraternity. We drank numerous nights a week and on the weekends, and it was just sort of a drunk fest. It's not something I'm really very proud about.
And what's going on with your eating disorder at this point?
It started to, I think it continued until my sophomore year in college.
Right.
And so about 10 years. It lasted for about 10 years.
Right.
And then it kind of morphed into an appetite for other things, for alcohol, for sex,
right,
for, for adventure. And I think.
Did you have a sense through this process that your sort of drinking and using was going to end badly? Did you have a
not
feeling
at this point?
No.
Not at this point. I mean, it's so strange. I was insulated by all of these people that were doing it themselves.
Right.
You could always find the group that was going to
Yeah.
be doing those things. And, I was never really reprimanded by my parents because I
Right.
skated through.
Right.
I always maintained a grade point average of higher than a B.
Right. Sure.
And I never had really any problems with academics, and I was athletic. And so they were really unaware, and the people around me were doing a lot of drugs and drinking, and they were all really smart and
Right.
and so it didn't seem like I was on a path towards destruction at that
Right.
point. After college, I moved to New York City,
Right.
and I once again was struggling to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, or I really was rudderless for a little while. And I got a job finally working as a casting associate at a casting office in the Warner Brothers Suites
Right.
in Midtown. And I moved downtown to Greenwich Village and lived in this little apartment. And at that time, I was introduced to this whole new group of people that were involved in writing plays and producing plays and acting, and,
Right.
and musicians that were writing songs and making albums. And it was just a really exciting time.
Sure.
And I felt like the creativity in me was really connecting to their creativity.
Right.
And that's when I was really introduced to cocaine.
Right.
And it wasn't until I was introduced to cocaine that I really felt like my life was getting out of control.
Right.
And in New York at that time, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
Many of my friends would have it on them. I would have it on me. You could buy it at the clubs. You could buy it at different places if you know where to get it. Their dealers would deliver it to your house. And so there was a lot of cocaine around. And, I think there was a lot of sadness in me from my childhood that was unresolved. And the cocaine really sort of took it all away.
Right.
Made me feel confident, made me feel articulate, made me feel vibrant, made me feel accepted. And for a few years, it was really an exciting time. It was a lot of fun. We stayed out late, but as with addiction, as you know, it really got its hooks in me.
Yeah.
And I began to use it when my friends weren't using it. And I began to use it alone.
Right.
And I began to isolate a little bit more. And my personality began to change a bit. I became increasingly more unsettled and a bit paranoid. And people approached me and were a little bit concerned.
Right.
My family at that point, I have two sisters, and they were certainly aware of the fact that every time they saw me, I seemed like I was wired.
Right.
And so at about age 30, I know maybe about 28 or 29, I decided that I was going to pack up all my things and move to Los Angeles, because LA was going to be the place for me to start doing yoga and eat macrobiotic food and walk on the beach and breathe in the sea air. And
Get well.
And really turn my life around.
Right.
And I arrived in Beechwood Canyon.
Right.
And I got this little bungalow, which to this day I still think about it. It was a great little spot. And ended up hooking up with a number of friends that were living around that area that were continuing the party.
Right.
And there was this one house up in the canyon where there was a constant party going on.
Sure.
And I became part of it was within walking distance of my house. And at any hour of any day or night, there seemed to be something happening there. And there were lots of drugs. There was ecstasy. There was cocaine, certainly, lots of alcohol. And I, once again, found the people.
Were you working?
I was, quote unquote, a film producer.
Right.
That, and I'm not sure what that meant. I was developing projects. I was taking some meetings, but I never got hired. I never had a 9-to-5 job.
Right.
I was running out of money. I sold my apartment in New York, and I had amassed a certain amount of money, and I was running out. And I had a friend who I knew from the East Coast who also lived in Beechwood. Right. And one night we were over at his house, and he said, you know what I'd love to do tonight? I'd love to smoke some crack. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, what is he talking about? He must be joking. And he said, no, crack is great. I love crack. And I thought, well, here's a kid from the East Coast, who's a college graduate who has a job out here, and he's saying that crack is okay. So I don't know, maybe we should try it. Sure. So we ended up getting some crack and smoking that. And
where did you get the crack? Just out of curiosity, did you drive to go get it, or did you have it?
No, he knew a dealer. Right. That delivered to us, and he not only delivered crack, but he also delivered heroin.
Right.
And I had never taken heroin before in any form, and didn't know that people use them together.
Right.
And we ended up, staying up for 2-3 days smoking crack and heroin.
Wow.
And that was my first introduction to that.
And how was it?
It was, in the beginning, it was phenomenal. It took away all the pain, all the psychological pain, all the emotional pain, made me feel euphoric, made me feel invincible, made me feel great. And whenever I got too high, I would smoke the
heroin.
The heroin, and it would bring me down. And it was just, once again, these were people that I really liked, that were good people that I trusted, that I had history with, that it felt safe,
Yeah, sure.
And there was a contingent of us that for the next 6 months did this on a fairly regular basis. Not every day, but maybe a few times a week, whenever we could.
And when you would get high on crack and heroin, would you just sit around the apartment talking, or would you go out in the world? And
we would go out in the world. We would drive around. We'd go to parties. We would be social.
Have a normal fun time. Right.
It wasn't incapacitating.
Sure.
But over the next year and a half, I began to develop a real habit.
Right.
And it became a daily habit. And when you have a daily habit like that, you go through money. And also, because I had this place where people could gather, people were always coming, and I was sort of hosting this continuous 24-hour-a-day party at my place. And something psychologically shifted in me after about a year and a half, and I became increasingly paranoid.
Right.
And so I kicked everyone out. I didn't want to have anyone there.
Right.
And over the course of maybe 6 months, I started hearing voices.
Right.
And whenever I would smoke, I would hear these people talking to me.
Right.
And it was scary.
Yeah.
It was really frightening. And I was convinced that I was under surveillance.
Right.
And I thought that I was being watched by the FBI and the CIA. I thought my place was bugged. I was terrified. It was a really terrifying experience because I believed it.
Yeah.
And there's one scene in the memoir that I've written where I've been up on my roof and I'm hearing these voices, and I dig a hole underneath my bungalow and I slither under there.
Wow.
And my neighbor comes and he sees me, my leg sticking out, and he's like,
"Oh my God,
are you okay? What's going on?" he pulls me out, and I'm like, "You're in on it. I know you're in on it.
Oh
Leave me
God.
alone. Everybody's watching me." And I tear down the Beechwood Canyon in just my underwear
Right. Wow.
and run to my friend's apartment.
Right.
And he takes one look at me and he says, "Oh, you've been up for a few days." He consoles me, and I go and hide in the bathtub because I'm convinced that at any moment people are going to bust down the doors and arrest me. And that was really a time in my life where it's comical now to think of it, but it was really distressing, really terrible time. And my parents showed up. My mother actually showed up with my sisters soon after and took me to treatment.
Right.
And I went to treatment for 30 days. And the treatment center I went to was called Promises, and it was over on the west side. And they had a sober living that was right off of Lincoln. And I thought to myself, well, when I get out of this sober living, I'm going to move to Venice, because Venice is far away from Hollywood,
right,
where I was doing all of this nefarious stuff. And so I moved to Venice after treatment.
I mean, let me ask you something. The treatment center, that's the first time you've gotten sober, yeah?
Yeah.
And how do you respond, like, psychologically? I mean, are you into it?
I absolutely loved it. I thought, because I'm a spiritual person and I love to sit around and talk about my feelings, and
right.
I think the narcissistic part of me felt like I had an audience and I was being heard. And
right.
And it was also, I had been on such a run, I was exhausted.
I mean, did you have to, like, do some detox to when you're there? Or
no, I didn't have to do detox.
Right.
You don't really have to detox from cocaine, but
right.
so I went into the groups right away, and I had a therapist that I liked, and it was fun, you know. It was. I felt like I was taking a 28-day nap, really.
Yeah. No, I mean, there have been times, even as a, sober person, when, like, shit's gotten difficult, and I'm like, I just wish I could go to rehab.
Right.
It was, where it's just all overwhelming, and I'm like, I just want it to stop. I mean, in some ways, like, this whole COVID experience is like, it's like, oh wow, we're all in rehab, right? We're all on this, like, giant pause. But
I know. So it was a good experience in that sense. I got into trouble in the rehab, of course, because they didn't think I was taking it seriously enough, and they had to put me on a contract. And then there was a girl that I knew from years before who showed up to run one of the groups.
Oh, wow.
And the two of us started to develop feelings for each other, had a little bit of a relationship, and that was strictly against the rules. So I got in trouble for that. And, I just was not very compliant with the way things were run there. But when I got out, I thought, I'm going to give this sobriety thing a chance. And so I started going to meetings. I went to a 12-step program and was pretty diligent about that. And but I didn't realize that Venice at that time was the epicenter of the crack cocaine epidemic on the west side of Los Angeles.
Right.
And it was the stronghold of the Shoreline Crips.
Right. What year is this now? Just out of curiosity.
What
year are we talking?
We're talking 2003.
Right.
So you would walk into Venice at that time, into the Oakwood neighborhood,
right,
and there would be a dealer on every corner.
Right. Sure.
And there was a community center there, and there were about 20 teenage dealers that would, have anything. Well, not anything, but they would, if you drove through, they would all bum rush your car. And
sure,
there was no police presence in Venice at that time. And so I really didn't know that.
Yeah.
But of course, 3 months sober, 4 months sober, when a dealer walking down the street, I was walking up Abbot Kinney, said, "Hey, what do you need?" I, of course, didn't have the strength to say no. And
Right.
so I began using again.
Right.
And this is when my life got a really, I had a very unique experience. And this is the real time that I focus on in the book that I
Right.
wrote. And my parents at that point realized what was happening, and they completely cut me off.
Right.
I was being evicted from my apartment.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a bank account. I didn't have a phone, didn't have a computer. But the one thing I did have was a car. I had this old beat up Ford Taurus. And because of that car, I was introduced to a drug dealer
Right.
in the hood. It was a former Shoreline Crip.
Right.
And he hired me to be his driver.
Wow.
And so for the next 6 months.
Who introduced you guys? Just another dealer?
So this sort of street hustler guy that I knew,
Right. Uh-huh.
who knew I had a car.
Right.
He was
Right.
like, this guy's looking for a car. You have a car.
Right.
I put you guys together.
Amazing.
And I was really alone at that time in my life. And this dealer was actually a really interesting guy. He was, we were from different races and different backgrounds and different.
Was he from LA? Did he grow up in LA?
He grew up in LA, yeah.
Right.
Grew up in Compton.
Yeah.
But he was book smart, and he was self-educated, and he was kind and spiritual.
And was he still using?
I was still using.
But was he? Point. Did he use also?
A little bit,
right? But he was more.
He was mainly just dealing,
right?
And he and I, over the next 6 months, became sort of partners in crime, and we developed this friendship. And he lived with his grandmother in Venice, and his grandmother became this maternal figure towards me, and they invited me into their home. And it was really this family that I had always wanted to have. And
who else is in the house? It's the grandmother, him, just the two of them.
Yeah, and he had a girlfriend who was pregnant, but they had another apartment, but he was in his grandmother's house a lot.
Right.
But they offered me a place to stay there. And,
so you lived there?
I never actually moved in, but they were trying to get me there. But I spent a lot of time there.
Where were you living?
I had my little place, and then I was evicted, and I was homeless for a little while. I was living.
Right. Wow.
But
would you sleep in your car?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I did, and it got very, the compassion and the caring and the love that they offered me and the friendship they offered me was something that really compelled me to actually want to start to get better.
That's crazy. How, I mean, like a day in the life of working for this guy, what were your hours?
They were definitely late afternoon to late night.
And was there how much driving was actually involved? I mean, are you guys hanging out?
We drove down to Compton. We drove to Santa Monica. We drove to Hollywood. We drove to South Central. We drove to Inglewood. We were making deliveries, and we were.
What would he pay you?
He paid me in product, and he gave me a little money.
Oh, interesting. Right. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's dark.
I know. It was very dark, but it was,
what would you guys talk about?
We talked about our fathers. We talked about his father abandoned him when he was 10 years old. His mother had abandoned him too. And I had this alcoholic mother. And so although we were from very different worlds, we had a lot in common.
Right.
We talked about Catcher in the Rye. He loved that book. And different books that we had read. We just, like you would talk about things with any of your friends. And he talked about his experience growing up. I talked about my experience growing up. And we just really liked each other.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And soon after that, I left, and
You left where?
I left Venice. Things
So,
got pretty scary.
I mean, what, like, yeah. So, I mean,
I need to leave.
no, I'm just kind of curious. Like, you're driving around from, you're getting this relationship, you're finding this like sense of place and home and family
Yeah.
in this house. Does the grandmother cook?
She did cook. She would feed us. Yeah.
And you're sort of getting this sense that like you want to
Yeah. Get better.
And then
He gets arrested.
oh, okay.
He got arrested, and the whole little perfect family in the perfect world crumbled.
Right.
And then some people that he was protecting me from
Right.
started coming after me.
Oh, wow.
And so I feared for my life, and I had to leave.
Where'd you go?
My mother had a farm up in Massachusetts.
Wow.
And so I went there, and of course she was in an alcoholic haze and taking pills. And so it wasn't a great place for me to continue to try and be sober.
Right. Had you been getting sober before you left for the farm?
I had a couple weeks of clean time.
And did you call your mother in that period to say?
I never called her. I just
showed up.
I had money in my pocket from some of the deals that we were doing, and I took the bus to the airport because I was really scared at that point. Right. And I just showed up.
Right.
Showed up in Boston, called her from a payphone, was like, "I'm here."
Right.
And she always had said to me, "You're always welcome here."
Right.
So I lived there for about 6 months, ended up crashing a car and hurting myself.
You're back using again, or
back using again. Yeah.
Right.
Driving into Hartford, Connecticut, buying drugs, coming back. And it was it wasn't a happy time, because it was just, I was at that place where I knew that the drugs weren't working for me anymore. It was no longer a fun experience. I was searching for something, for some kind of meaning, for some sort of purpose in my life, and I didn't know what it was going to be. And I was lost. I was just really lost. I remember I was at age 34. I was sleeping on my mother's couch in her farmhouse in Massachusetts and thinking, how did I get here?
Sure.
What am I going to do with my life? And I had no idea at that point. And I was driving the car one night after drinking and taking Valium, and I crashed into a tree going about 40 miles an hour and was hurt really badly. I broke some ribs, had a concussion, ruptured my spleen, dislocated my knee, had lacerations all over the lower part of my body. And I was in intensive care in the hospital for several days. And they had me strapped down to the bed. So my arms were strapped down and my legs were strapped down because they wanted to try and save my spleen.
Right.
And I remember thinking to myself, as the nurse was coming in and putting a bedpan under me, here I am. I can't go to the bathroom myself. I can't feed myself. And I've lost everything.
Right.
And if I don't make a change right now, I'm gonna end up dead.
Right.
And that was the real moment for me. That was the real turning point for me. And that's when I said, I really need to go back to treatment. I ended up going back to treatment.
Did you go to the same place?
I went to a place called the Meadows in Arizona, and then ended up going after that for another 4 months to a place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, called the Life Healing Center. While I was in treatment, decided that I couldn't return back to Los Angeles and I couldn't return to Boston. And so I might as well stay there.
Right.
And ended up applying to graduate school while I was in treatment.
Right.
And that was the beginning of my recovery.
And you applied to graduate school to study?
Psychology. There were some therapists that were there that I became friends with and that were really instrumental in me doing some healing, and that I really identified with and really found to be fascinating. And they encouraged me. They said, there's this school, this really interesting alternative school of psychology here in Santa Fe. You might just apply, you got nothing better to do. I don't know what you're planning on doing. And so I applied. I ended up getting in.
Right.
My family had completely cut me off at that point, and I had no money at all.
Right.
And I broke down one day in treatment in a group about 4 days before I was supposed to be discharged, because they were going to drop me off at the homeless shelter in Santa Fe.
Right.
And this really amazing guy in the group said, listen, I have money. Tell me how much you need and promise me you'll pay me back. And he wrote me a check for $5,000.
Amazing.
And with that money, I went and I got a tiny little sublet apartment in town in Santa Fe. And I didn't have a car, but the apartment came with a rickety old 10-speed bike. And it was the dead of winter in Santa Fe. It was about 0 degrees.
Right.
I didn't have a coat or shoes. And I was riding around Santa Fe at 0 degrees on this bike, and dropping off resumes, trying to get a job.
Right.
Ended up getting a job as a waiter, and waited tables for a couple of years. And I took classes at a community college for a year to get prerequisites to be able to go to this graduate school, and then started school and really started this whole new part of my life, which was learning about psychology, was connecting with myself in a spiritual way that I'd always been interested in, but I was getting taught the methodology of how to do that. It was a very interesting alternative school. There was a lot of Native American ceremony and sweat lodges, talking sticks, and that sort of thing. And I worked with a shaman for about a year. At that time, was still going to meetings.
And have you continued to sort of incorporate that sort of form of spirituality into your life?
Yes, very much so.
And how does that sort of, manifest itself on a daily basis?
Well, when I left Santa Fe, I came back to Los Angeles and I continued my journey in school. And I went to school for another 6 years and earned a doctorate in psychology. The school that I went to here was as a Jungian school. Right. Up in Santa Barbara. Right. And Jung believed very much in the soul. Right. And it's really the premise of his work, that we have a soul and that the soul's is really our most authentic self and authentic nature. And it is benevolent and it communicates with us all the time. It's just that we as human beings have a hard time understanding it and don't really know don't understand the language of the soul. And depth psychology, which is what I do now, is really about trying to understand the language of the soul.
And how do you spell that, depth psychology?
Depth.
Depth. Okay.
DH. Yeah. And it's Jungian psychology, but it's depth psychology because there are some parts of it that are not Jungian. But it's really about trying to drop down into the unconscious and make some sense of what's going on and what it is unconsciously that's driving our thoughts and driving our actions and driving our behaviors. Because the unconscious, the cognitive mind is less than 10% of the reasons behind we do things. And so there's this vast well of the unconscious that so much is happening and so much is going on. And Jung's belief was that was governed by the soul. Right. And so that really fascinated me and really interested me and propelled me to want to continue my studies. And I became a voracious reader and worked really hard in school, took out student loans, worked the whole time I was in school.
Did you continue to work as a waiter, or were you working?
No, I was working at community mental health centers.
Right. Yeah, sure.
I was working at rehabs up in Malibu. Right. I worked, at 4 or 5 of the different treatment centers in Malibu at that time, because I was already licensed as a therapist,
Right.
but not as a psychologist.
Right. Sure.
So I was, but I was working, 38 hours at a treatment center, and then I would go to school, and so it was a really busy time in my life.
Sure.
But it was incredibly rewarding, because one of the things about my sobriety that is so instrumental and so important is feeling like I have a purpose.
Sure.
And for all of those years when I was using and I was lost, I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it was very confusing and a very lonely time.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was attracted to something that I really found interesting and valuable, I immersed myself in it. And from that point forward, I really have felt like I'm on a certain path.
Right.
And that's been so helpful to me.
I'm curious about your dad. Is he still alive?
My dad passed away a few years ago.
Right.
He had Alzheimer's for the past for the final years of his life, and it was very sad, as it always is with Alzheimer's. Sure. He lost his ability to communicate. He lost his ability to form words.
Right.
And so he couldn't really talk to us. And
did you guys were you able to sort of have some sort of reconciliation with your dad along the way? I mean,
I did. When I started doing this healing work, and I did some trauma work in treatment, and I continued to work with a shaman, and most of the work was around forgiveness.
Right.
And I ended up really being able to forgive my mother and forgive my father, because I placed so much blame on them for some years of all of these things. And when I was able to forgive them, it just, I felt so different psychologically. I felt free. I was very angry and resentful for a long time, and I didn't feel those things anymore. And so for the last years of my father's life, and even before that, even before he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, we developed a friendship and a relationship.
It's interesting at the start of this interview, you talked about like your early years and this sense of sort of safety and belonging and this like bubble of joy for those first 7 years. And, I wonder to what degree that grounds a person for the rest of their lives. So like, there's always that thing to come back to, that, you made it out, you made it to the other side, and so many people don't. And, I certainly know in my own struggle, there were so many times when like, I just wanted to be in the sunlight, and I could remember what it felt to stand in the sun. And like that memory often was what motivated me to, struggle out of whatever depths I was in to sort of find my way back to a place that I could remember when I was happier,
I think of that. That's such a good point that you're making, Nick. And I think of that time as pre 8 years old.
Right.
Where I remember sitting on the steps at our farmhouse in Massachusetts with the sun on my shoulders in the morning, eating a bowl of cereal. And it was just a feeling of being safe and feeling like I belonged and feeling like things were simple, and that I really had a sense of who I was. Right. And I knew that existed somewhere in me.
Right. Yeah.
Because I had felt it at that early age. But it took me, I got sober when I was 35. It took me 27 years to find it again.
Right. Yeah. And now, so how long have you been sober at this point?
I've been sober for 14 and a half years.
14 and a half years. Wow.
Yeah.
Time fucking flies, man.
Yeah. 14 and a half years. And it hasn't always been easy, certainly. But I've built a life that is something I'm really proud of. And I met my wife in sobriety. It's actually a pretty interesting.
Is she sober as well?
She is not sober.
Right.
She enjoys a little wine in the evenings, which certainly
Right.
does not bother me at this point.
Right.
But I met her. She was my sister's close friend from boarding school.
Right.
And I met her one weekend, and we had this sort of week-long romance many years before.
Right.
And it hadn't ended very well because, of course, I didn't treat her very well.
Right.
In my selfishness and my thoughtlessness. And when I got sober, a few years after I got sober, I thought about it and I realized that I really needed to make an amends to her.
Right.
And so I reached out to her. I didn't know how to get in touch with her. I found her on Facebook and I messaged her and she responded and I said, is there a time that we could talk? And I called her up, and this was 17 years later.
Wow.
And I made a heartfelt amends to her on the phone.
Uh-huh.
And she ended up, I was going to be in New York soon after that, and said, could we have lunch?
Right.
She said, okay, I'll meet you for coffee or lunch. And
right.
we ended up having some lunch together and realized that the spark was still there.
That's amazing.
And it never left. And
that's so cool.
We started dating, and 6 months later we were engaged, and a year later we were married.
That's wild. That's amazing. You guys have two kids, yeah? Yeah. That's that's incredible.
And now we have two children. I have a 3-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter.
Right.
We live up in Topanga Canyon, and we have this beautiful 1925 beam and post house, which is a very funky, beautiful Topanga gem. And we have 2 dogs, a little puppy that's driving me crazy right now.
And the book is out. What's the book called again?
The book is called Lost in Ghost Town. It's a memoir, and it came out 3 weeks ago. It was printed and sold and distributed by Simon & Schuster.
Cool.
And it's
how long did it take you to write it?
It took me a couple of years to write it.
Right.
It took me a couple of years. I worked with an editor while I was writing it, and then I had to get an agent, which wasn't an easy thing to do, and I found a great agent finally. Right. After a lot of rejection, I might add.
Sure.
And then after a lot of rejection from publishers, we found a great publisher, and I feel very fortunate because getting a book published, being not a non-celebrity these days, is really like threading the needle. And it's out there in the world now, and I'm getting great feedback and really good reviews. I got a great review in Rolling Stone magazine, so that was a big thrill. And
that's amazing. And are you going to write another book?
I'm actually writing another book right now.
Right.
And it's about addiction. It's more of a psychology book, a popular, like they call pop psychology.
Right.
About addiction, looking at addiction through a Jungian lens.
Right.
So it's really this idea that addiction is an archetype, and it's archetypal, and it's something that we all share to some degree.
Wow.
So even those who don't identify as addicts or would not be traditionally referred to as addicts, I feel have the energy of addiction in them.
Totally. You see it all over the place.
I see it all the time. And I see it
all over the place.
I'm a psychologist now, and I work with patients, and the idea really spawned out of speaking to them and talking to them, and each one of them really having their own form of addictive behavior in their life.
Sure. Yeah. That's cool. That sounds great. Well, Carter, I mean, it's amazing to hear all this. I mean, I feel like I had a lot of moments where my life glanced up against yours over the years, but I never really understood the breadth and the depth and the range of the story, where it began and where it ended. It's amazing to hear it. And I'm so glad I got the chance. So thanks
so much, Nick.
Thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with me. I really, I loved it.
Hey, so if you've been enjoying this podcast, you can head over to my Patreon page and feel completely free to support the show with a modest contribution at www.patreon.com/thedrunkalogs. The Drunkalogs cover art is designed and created by John DeManil, and the Drunkalogs theme song is composed and performed by Stephen Stout. I am Nick Morton.